Welcome. And yep, I'm going to hop straight into it. We need to talk. That's the title of tonight's gathering. You did talk and you brought family violence to the front of public discourse. But given the prevalence of family violence, and we know the figures that 1 in 3 women are going to experience it, I think there have been 2 women murdered a week in Australia so far this year. Why haven't we talked about it until now?
It's a really good question, isn't it? And perhaps because, through generations past, it wasn't seen as anyone's business. We probably out of shame and no one was interested. It was something that if it was part of your family, you just had to suffer in silence and get on with it because it was seen as a domestic, that was private, it was your business. And it didn't even, the law worked against you and the police response wasn't there either.
Some have continued to argue that what happens in private should stay private. So you would argue that's still a prevailing thought?
Look, I just think that we're so used to just it not being talked about. We actually are only just beginning to understand because it wasn't communicated properly in the media. It was never on the political agenda. It's never been discussed. So we're really understanding now that it is an enormous problem, way worse than anyone ever had realised.
You suffered at the hands of Luke's father in the years leading up to that ultimately atrocious act. Prior to, did you ever try to talk about it with friends or colleagues?
Yes, and look, I think that, there's a lot of things that happen that appear petty behaviours, incidents that are not serious enough to involve the police. This is ongoing behaviour, that starts perhaps at the start of a relationship where derogatory put-down language, verbal abuse. And it's very confusing because you've invested into a relationship with possibility. You are hooked in emotionally. And the behaviour can be very confusing because it isn't always bad, it isn't always ugly. But when incidences of conflict arise, that desire for power and control comes in. And as you become desensitised to the verbal abuse, other powers need to come into play. So those instances can be months and years apart. But one thing is for sure, the violence always escalates. So unfortunately, no one can really predict and that was going to ultimately end in such a tragedy, but over a very long period of time. When you're not living with someone, and I never did marry Greg, and I never did live with him, but when you have a child that you have access arrangements, you are clearly going to be subjected to, opportunities for ongoing violence.
You said you didn't actually, you had a child and you had to organise those shared access arrangements, but in a lot of circumstances, people are together. And the Premier raised this, that there is still a tendency in some quarters to blame the victim, blame women for staying. Why are you exposing your children to this? Why aren't you leaving?
Well, I think that, sometimes, and it certainly was the case for me, you are so confused in your relationship that you actually don't necessarily understand that what you are experiencing is indeed violence, that you actually do not deserve and have not caused that type of behaviour, and that indeed that verbal abuse is violence, that psychological violence is violence. So a lot of the things that you are managing, you are trying to modify your behaviour, you're trying to avoid or make sure it doesn't happen. What we do is assume that it is your choice to leave a relationship, that indeed, why on earth wouldn't you? What we don't understand is that, one, we have an emotional investment into somebody that we care about and have cared about. Two, we have a home that we have, built and made into our home that we don't want to leave. And we have a family that we don't want to disrupt and ruin. So we have lots of reasons why we don't want to leave, but very, very clearly, when you do leave, that's one of the highest risks of homelessness and putting you into a situation of potential poverty. Also, what we don't realise is when you do choose to leave, that is your highest risk, that you're actually escalating a situation that you do not know what the outcome may be. And there may have been significant threats to your life or the life of your loved ones, not just children, but family members, pets. So there are many, many reasons that when you do take a stand to bring the police, it's probably because you've been driven to it because a situation has arisen that is very concerning and you have no other choice. Because when you involve the police, when you involve the court system, you are not clear what may happen next. You've upped the ante. You don't know from that time what he's going to do to you because of what you've done. So there are many reasons, and it's not cowardice. It's absolutely fear of what may happen to you and your children and what you may put them through. And what we do is expect the victim to take responsibility for her own safety. We expect her to remove herself and go into hide in a refuge. We expect her to take out intervention orders and navigate the court process. And the whole situation too means we don't have the financial means to go through the court process quite often. So our access to justice is compromised again. And our perpetrators are able to use our court systems as a further avenue of abuse. So what we do have is when you do engage in the process as opposed to protect us, it's not a guarantee that anything can stop unless the perpetrator decides to stop being violent.
Another thing that the Premier touched upon is, and it's something I'd like to clarify early on in this discussion, is that some have raised the concern publicly, whether that be through letters to the editor or on Talkback Radio and so on, that men are also victims of family violence and abusive relationships. Why is this conversation about women?
Well, I think certainly violence is wrong, regardless of whether it's man against woman or woman against man. But it's really clear women who subject men to violence, and I do know that there are some, does not mean that the man is in fear of his life. It invariably is not a life-threatening situation. But we come again to statistics, and the statistics are clear. It is not 2 men a week that are being murdered. It is 2 women. And when we look at our TVs and we see the violence on our TV screens, it is clearly men's violence, not just to women, but men's violence to other men too. And what I would like is to just introduce Darren, your police commissioner, because I do think when a police commissioner, who also happens to be a man, actually very clearly says this is a gender issue, and this issue is about men being violent towards women and their children, I think it really puts to rest that this is an issue. So Darren.
Yeah, thanks. Look, it's every time we put the issue up on our Facebook site, and I know Matt has the same issue about men standing up against violence against women and their children, we get a number of comments about what about men being victims. And whilst we can't condone any form of violence in our community, and we must get that message out there, but as Rosie said, it is a fact that 85% of women are killed or injured by a male. And that's a fact. We can't get away from it. It is there. So I'll continue to stand up as a man and as a police commissioner and as a father to actually say violence against women is wrong. And we have to work and continue to work to get that message out there that we do need to eliminate violence against women and their children by men. It's not a fact we can actually hide. It's not an issue we can put under the carpet. So we as men need to stand up. And through Rosie, good work, and the conversations that we're having today, we can actually influence whether you're a husband, whether you're a father, or a community member, we can actually influence a number of young males and men in our community to actually stand up and say, it's just not right, it's not on. We do need to take a stand and have that difficult conversation, as the Premier said.
So, Rosie, do we have a gender sort of a cultural problem in Australia that, is it young people, middle-aged people, older people, you know, we're seeing controlling behaviour is seen as a sign of strength?
Look, I think, it very much is, and I think what's really most disturbing is the fact of our young people's attitudes, and again, recent surveys tell us that their attitudes are actually, more damaged than they were 5 years ago. So what I mean more damaged, they're more accepting of violence. They're more accepting that a slap, if there's an apology, can be excused, or if there's alcohol involved, it's excusable. And where young men actually believe that a demonstration of their love is controlling behaviour. So where do they get these views of relationships and behaviour? Is it from our modelling as parents and within our communities? Or is it influence from gaming, from pornography? Where are these influences coming? The very absolute fact is, it is very, very clear that those are the attitudes from young people. So we really have to change this and address it.
Well, in terms of changing and addressing things here in Tasmania, you met with Cabinet this morning to discuss their plan to tackle family violence. Does the government's action plan get your tick of approval, or is there more work to be done?
Look, there's still a lot that I need to learn and understand, which I haven't been privy to yet. But I do know that there is a genuine intent from everybody I've met here in Tasmania that leads me to believe and have trust that this problem is being taken very seriously, and they absolutely have no one has all of the answers, but it starts with a determination not to accept an excuse, but actually to take a very strong and definite approach, and I believe that that's what the intention is here.
One of the things that you've called for in terms of that very definite approach is for respectful relationships programs to be taught in schools, to teach about gender, power and control. Is it your understanding that the Tasmanian government will take on board that in terms of its action plan?
Look, I think there is no doubt that that type of approach is welcomed, and I think that there needs to be that collaboration with schools with a realistic approach, and I'm hopeful that that will, will be something that we will work towards, because what we're looking at is clearly really from 3-year-old kinder upwards, that in actual fact, we do need to start as early as possible. But when we do this, we need a whole school approach, we need accredited programs, we need to do it properly, and we need it in every school, in every suburb, across the state and every state of Australia. If we are going to see the type of shift of attitudes through society and see that change come about, we really need a proper approach, a very strong approach. Because currently there are some schools doing a really great job, and there are some already very good programs. But what we do need